Hi, this is Paul, and what we're going to do today is the culmination of something I've wanted to do for a very long time, which is talk about, I'm still working on the naming of it, but for today, let's call it the marriage crisis. When I started my local meetup, most of the people who came to my local meetup were interested in Jordan Peterson, and they were young men, unmarried. And very quickly, a lot of conversations ensued about, and I still don't, maybe today as we talk about it, we'll figure out better language for it. But I found a number of young men who were quite frustrated with the state of affairs in terms of meeting and then basically getting to marriage. And actually, my wife came home from a retreat or an outing with some girlfriends, and she came back and said, "You know, I know all these women in their early to mid 30s who are really wonderful women, and they're successful, and they're all complaining about how they can't find a man." And I thought, huh, this is a conversation that we need to have. And so then for a long time, I actually approached the women were the hardest to sort of um, um, get agreement on in coming to this conversation, because I don't know why that is, but I had a difficult time finding a group that I wanted involved. I knew I wanted James from our local meetup, and I knew I wanted Joey from our local meetup. And through some conversation on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, we have a couple other women that are going to participate today. So we're going to go probably for about 2 hours and talk, and we'll see. But there, I think, will be a lot of different aspects of the marriage crisis that we'll talk about in upcoming shows, if you will. So this I plan on doing something of a series with. So why don't each of you introduce yourselves a little bit and tell us the interest that you have in this topic? Anyone can go first. Then maybe that's the hardest way. James, why don't you go first?
Hi, my name is James, and I'm a part of the local meetup group here with Paul and Joey. And so I haven't met Cassidy or Catherine before, but it's going to be a good, interesting conversation, and I look forward to hearing from them about this topic. It's one that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a community college professor, and I teach psychology. And while my favorite class to teach is statistics, I also end up teaching human sexuality, mostly because nobody else wants to teach that. And I don't have any problems talking about it. So in the context of my job, a lot of times I get encounters with students who are considering these issues, and how it comes up for them is tremendously impactful on me, because I see them not having a supportive culture and not having a system around them that's going to move them towards positive things for themselves. And so that's why I was interested in this conversation.
Okay. Catherine, how about you?
Well, I am from Canada. I've got 3 kids. I've been married for 15 years. I am interested in the conversation because I feel like it is very much the crux of a lot of different things in the culture coming together. There's a lot of patterns that have been happening for a really long time, and it impacts, if not everybody's life personally, people that they're close to. And I work as a therapist. I have for about a decade, and I've had a lot of people I've talked with and worked with where this is very central to what they're wrestling with. So personally, I'm interested in exploring it on a cultural level, but also as a clinician, it's helpful if we can get more handles for this or articulate it in better ways. Hopefully it'll be helpful for a lot of people.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. Joey, how about you?
All right, just coughed. So sorry. Yeah, I'm Joey. I'm part of the Sacramento meetup group. I guess the insight I'm trying to bring to this is I've worked in consulting, so I've moved a lot. I'm 34 years old, so I've grown up in the period where I used pretty much all of the online dating options or social options for meeting people, going back to, I think Zanga was before MySpace, and then there was MySpace, and then Hot or Not was a thing that was kind of the pre-Facebook, because even Facebook started as a looks rating website. So that was kind of a phenomena for a while. And basically going through that period, and just because of the number of friends I had and because of my job and because I've moved so many times, I've worked in a lot of different offices. I've seen a lot of different people who through it probably were more honest with me than they should have been. So I think I have a lot of insight that I wouldn't otherwise have. And again, from a non-clinical perspective too. So that's probably a unique insight. And I'm hoping that we can not come up with a set of solutions, because that's too straightforward, but I'm hoping that we can come up with some good advice for younger people that maybe I didn't receive. And if I can do that, that's I feel like that's a worthwhile endeavor.
Thanks, Joey. How about you, Cassidy?
Yeah, so I am a filmmaker and an entrepreneur, but I also have been like highly religious my whole life. And so that's sort of an odd thing being in entertainment. And so I grew up non-denominational evangelical at the height of the purity culture. So I got a lot of ideas of what it was to date and what it was to sort of lead to marriage. And I appreciate that a whole lot, but I also, in the last couple of years, have started to realize how some of those things were a little bit sort of damaging, and how I didn't always operate in the best way within them. And so I've been rethinking this whole idea of what it is to be married. And yeah, I always felt sort of like an oddball. I'm 28, so I'm sort of older for a religious person who's unmarried. And I always sort of felt like an oddball in all the worlds that I lived, where I wasn't the typical Christian girl who was subdued and, quiet and just wanted to raise a family. But I wasn't this sort of typical person in entertainment that I didn't find a lot of people who were very suitable there either. So there was been a lot of struggle of like trying to find a partner and trying to figure out how I pursue that.
Three of us are married. I'm the oldest in this group. I've been married this August. I will be married 33 years. So that's in our congregation. If someone has an anniversary and it's a big number, we often congratulate them, because being married a long time is actually a pretty substantial achievement, I find. Maybe we can begin by, Cassidy, I think you started on it. When I was married in 1988, and I was married at a time and in a Christian culture that had a number of norms that really moved people pretty successfully towards marriage. In our Christian community, there was a premarital sex was against the norm. So marriage was sort of you get to have sex card. That kind of kept people focused. While in the Christian community, I think at that point, there wasn't a lot of divorce. Most of the people that I went to college with were from homes where father and mother, they were raised in a home of a biological father and mother. I met my wife at Calvin College, and Calvin College in the Christian Reformed Church was in many ways a predecessor for something like Match.com, because everybody sort of knew you went to Calvin College to find your mate. And I didn't find the woman I would marry until my fourth year there. And that took me about that long to say, you know what? I'm probably not going to have a menu quite so broad of people with common values, commonalities. And maybe I should be a little bit more serious about this endeavor. And actually, when I finished Calvin College and started Calvin Seminary, myself and only two other seminarians in my class were unmarried. All of the rest of them were. And so when I look at, so now I have 5 children. None of them are married. All of them, my oldest just turned 30, and my youngest just will turn 22 this week. So I have 5 children in their 20s, and I look at the context in which they the context in which they approach this challenge. And I think they have a lot of challenges I never had, because it seemed to me like there was a culture, which by no means was perfect, but there was a culture that sort of gave people at least motivation, incentive, and some degree of support to actually say, okay, I'm in my early or mid 20s. Let's get serious about finding a spouse. These are the patterns, and there's some community support around it. Maybe, starting maybe with Joey or Cassidy, what is it like now? What is it like? Joey's over 30 and Cassidy's under 30. What has it been like for you guys in this? Cassidy grew up in a Christian home. Joey doesn't identify as Christian. So what has this been like for you guys?
For me, it's been sort of interesting. So like I said, I grew up in sort of this purity culture world, and neither of my parents grew up Christian. So they kind of found faith in college. They actually, funny story, they met at Liberty. So they, if that shows you anything of like sort of how they are a little bit. So they grew up, and we grew up with 3 girls. So my dad was always super protective about us. And I was never a person who was really interested in dating, especially younger. In fact, even when I started getting to like 18, 19, I was like, sounds like a lot of work. I gotta go to dinner with somebody and like small talk. It wasn't a thing that I really wanted. But I think as a Christian and in religious circles, there's a lot of pressure to marry young, especially because you're not participating in, sort of a lot of the physical relationships or the physical part of relationships, although a lot of that sort of varies, and a lot of that goes into the closet or whatever. So I didn't have my first boyfriend until I was 21, and we dated 3 years and then got engaged. And that was sort of right when, when we got engaged, right when I was going through my deconstruction. And so eventually we broke up because I just realized, like, I got to this place where I realized I wasn't ready to be in that place. And I thought in my head, okay, I'm going to get my life sorted, figure out my questions with God, and someday we'll get back together. And that definitely did not happen. And I think that left a lot of sort of questions in my mind of like, because the person who I was engaged to, actually, they walked away from their faith like 2 months after we broke up. And it was sort of like, it was very confusing for me, because like I was the one going through the questions, yet you're the one who walked away. And like we were supposed to build on this thing. And it was very confusing. And it took me at least 3 years to even get around the idea of like being able to move on and do something else, which was scary in a religious context, because I'm 24. And then by the time I'm 26, I'm like, I'm not even close to being ready to be in a relationship right now, but I'm getting older. And like, by the time I hit 30, it's going to feel like in religious communities, like I've like expired. Like that's like, I think that's a hard thing for women in religious communities. Like men can be in their 30s and marry a 26-year-old, but when you're a woman in your 30s, there's not a lot of men, because most of them got married very young, or the ones that haven't, like maybe they're not Christian, or they don't take it very seriously, or they're divorced, and it just gets all complicated. So it's not over, but it definitely makes things more difficult. And I never wanted to be that person to rush into marriage just because that was what I wanted. I just like, I wanted to do it right. And, I wanted to be healthy. And I was also sort of the one who thought like, maybe I'll never get married. Like that's a distinct possibility. And like, I guess I'm okay with that, but it's not necessarily what I want. And it really became hard, I think, after 24 and trying to rediscover what it meant to have a faith and follow God, and what it was to like have a right partner. It was really hard to find people within the church and people that suited, especially because I was not what most evangelical Christian men were looking for. And like Joey, I traveled a lot. I was, I had my own businesses. I was making a film for several years where I was always traveling, and it's just very, very different. But on the other hand, I'm like working in entertainment and I'm working in comedy, And there was just a lot there that wasn't appealing either. You know, this sort of like, almost like borderline questionable, like sexual expectation of like, you know, I've heard one too many said of like the comedian saying, you know, if I buy that lady a lobster dinner, she better like give me something. And it's like, I don't want to sell myself for a Chipotle burrito. I'm not into that. So it's been really hard to sort of balance that and manage that. Especially because I think especially now with my family, I don't consider myself evangelical anymore. I'm still Christian, but I have a totally different perception. And so the way that I pursue those types of relationships are outside of like the comfort zone of my family now. And so there's been some pressures in that too, which has been interesting. But I think that's sort of like the broad experience that I've had as a person in a religious community trying to find a relationship and a partnership that is like meaningful and healthy.
Joey, you mentioned you've been around for all the various electronic forums, but you didn't grow up with some of the expectations and culture that Cassidy did. What was your experience?
So I would say the larger part of my social circles probably echoed Christianity in a sense. It was we had kind of the expectation that that you wouldn't brag about having sex before marriage. Like it wouldn't be something that you did out in the open, but at the same time, we had enough access to different forms of both media and later social media that we all kind of understood that everyone was having sex, or at least trying to, and outside of the marriage context. So what were the rules? We didn't really know what the rules were. No one took the time to explain them to us. We knew our sexual education classes going back to, I think those began in about 4th grade. They were pretty good in terms of avoiding STDs, what you needed to do to avoid pregnancy, those kinds of basic safety things. But in terms of how to date, what were the courtship rituals essentially? No one really knew. And I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, so that's a huge metropolitan area. And in the suburbs, there's not much to do, but you do have access to everything in the city. You have access to most of the things outside in the country because either you or someone you knew had a cabin somewhere, or you could get to some place like that relatively easy. And you could get into as much or as little trouble as you wanted to. So I was somebody who through high school and early in my college, I avoided all that trouble by spending most of my time on the computer, which opens the doors to other type of trouble. But so I kind of was a late starter in that sense. And yeah, that was the most confusing thing to me was, I think, the difference between the societal kind of expectation of sex isn't really something you talk about with people who are more than a quarter of a generation removed. So maybe you could talk to somebody who's 5 or 6 years older than you, but if you were 18, you weren't talking to somebody in their late 20s. You were talking to somebody maybe 25 or younger. And if you were talking to somebody older than that, that was a little weird. And I don't really know where that rule even came, like that rule came from in my head, but I can say I definitely felt it. So where was I going with that? But I don't know. What is that? What does that spark in you? What do you want to know next?
I don't know. I think Catherine and James can jump in where they see fit.
Go for it, Catherine.
Is this a lot of the kind of thing that you've seen in terms of people you've worked with, or I mean, you can talk about your own experience too. I don't know where you met your husband and what that was like in terms of, you know, inside a let's say a religious culture or outside.
So I met my husband in a religious context. I was still in high school. He had just graduated the year before. We knew each other for a couple of years. He left town. When he moved back to town, I heard he was back in town. Tracked him down. Married him.
And you're talking a small community though. These are fairly small communities or not?
Yeah. So he's from a different town than I am, but he had come to a discipleship program that was being run where I was living. And so I met him there. I wasn't in the same program, but I was sort of in the, I don't know, in the area. And so I met him there. He finished the program, moved away. And sort of in the middle, I dated somebody else. We didn't date when we first met. I think partly because I was in high school and he was like, oh, you're too young. I don't know why, because it was a 1-year difference. But, but he moved
getting some
away.
good
I
dirt
dated
here.
somebody else. I know. And I dated the other person, and at the time I was like a very cynical person. So I was like, love does not exist. It doesn't matter. You marry somebody, eventually love will grow. Very like Fiddler on the Roof, like just marry somebody, live a committed life, have the same values. I dated that person for a while, and I was like, I would rather be dead than have to live a life with this person. I don't care if we have similar values. I'm not interested. He has since found somebody and has a family, and that's lovely. But I was like, forget this. And so I very much had my mind on like career. I had plans. I wanted to be a doctor and work overseas and sort of devote myself to missions. And then I remember, he came back to town, and my whole plan just went out the window. And I was like, oh, well, if you're back, then that changes things. And yeah, so I got married when I was 20.
Wow.
And then we were going to wait 8 years. I was still planning on being a doctor. We still had that as the agenda, but 3 months in, I got pregnant, and that set a new agenda. So
How do you feel about that?
Now I'm thrilled. I'm so happy. We have 3 kids. They're 14, 12, and 10. I would be thrilled to have 3 more kids. I am there now. That is not where I started. That was a very hard transition for me. I had not planned on having kids for a while, and I had not been sure I ever would want kids. So that was a really big shift. But then I got pregnant, and I was very much like, well, this is the hand God has given me, and it is my job to fulfill that task to the best of my ability. So I got on board, but it was not the agenda. But at this point, I am very much the mind that God knows what's better for us than we do. And it was all a gift, all wonderful. And it made me have to work through a lot of sort of the same things that led me to the place to be like, love isn't a thing. There was a lot of reinvesting in relationships and a vision of family, and that work had to be done for me, which part of what did that was having children. So that was really good. But another thing that taps into this conversation is I have a lot of people I talk with now, and they have no interest in having children. They'll say things like, well, I'd like to have a partner and a boat and a dog, and I'd be happy to be an auntie, but I don't want to have kids. I don't want to, that seems like, I don't know if I'd be good at it. It seems like a lot of work. It's not really my thing. Kids are great, but so that's another place where more of my recent experience tapping into this is through people who feel very disinterested in the whole vision of family.
Do you have any sense of why that has emerged from listening to some of these people? Or do they have a sense of why they don't want to have a family?
A lot of people I talk to, it just seems like a lot of work to them. Like there's like a mommy mode, and they're not interested in that style of life, and they don't see the benefit down the road. Or they don't see how that would be good for them, because they're not wrong. Being a parent is a ton of self-sacrifice, a ton of work. It, especially if you're the wife, it can ruin a lot of things that you had for plans for your body, for, just lifestyle. You have to give all of that up if you're going to be a half decent mother. So I think for a lot of people, they don't see why the trade-off would be to their benefit. It just doesn't make sense.
And to hop on that, I don't think that I feel like my generation wasn't taught that. I'm not sure what people younger than me are taught, but it's one of those things that you have to choose your path, and otherwise the path will be chosen for you. And there was lots and lots of emphasis put on, especially around sexual education, of if you get an STD, essentially these are the doors that close to you. If you get pregnant, these are the doors that close to you. And that's probably to the benefit, because, teenage pregnancy is not a great thing. Single mother pregnancy is not a great, it's not the ideal. We can at least put it that way, I think, fairly without offending anyone. But I don't know that there's the off switch is installed for that, especially in women, but also in men, of the once I am settled down, so to speak, all these doors closed to me. I certainly felt that in my career early on, of that. Don't get too attached to a girlfriend in college. Definitely don't get attached to a girlfriend in high school. Don't get attached to a girlfriend in college. And then early on in your career, don't get attached to somebody, because that will could ruin your career, or could close doors to you that come up in the future. And it's not wrong either. That's the other problem. I've definitely had access to the ability to do job changes that were great for my career because I'm not attached to anyone. Looking back, would I do that again? I'm not sure the money was worth it. So, I mean, and that's a guy at 34. And like Cassidy said, I do still have more options than women who have hit this age. And yeah, I can see why people are upset. I can see why people are scared. But I also don't, on the flip side of that, I don't see some of the popular online perceptions of the negativity of the dating market being as real as they are. So I'm not sure if that's something we want to talk about too, or if we want to focus more on more on the gaps of what's happened.
There's tons in this whole arena that is worth talking about. James, I think James we'll have James talk, and then all of you can, don't feel bashful about jumping in on each other. I know most of you won't, but so James, you both teach people that are sort of in this phase, and of course you've had your own experience. So I don't know what you'd like to go on off of.
Well, I'm married. I have 3 boys. Catherine, mine are just turned 13, 10, and 8. So I'm a little bit behind you. And my wife and I, we got married. Joey, you were talking about how online dating changed things. And so my wife and I met when she was 23, I was 24. And online dating wasn't something that was happening. In fact, anybody that had Match.com was just a dork. Just a total geek, and nobody would want to date somebody who was on one of those sites. And now the ubiquity of the social situation where we find ourselves is that's where you must go. That's the proverbial bar where you're going to go to find somebody, is so foreign to me that I'm having to learn about that entire experience from my students, from my friends who are younger and experiencing it. And it really gives me, I'm not somebody prone to anxiety, but I can see why there's such anxiety surrounding this. And we talked briefly about this before, which is you're putting yourself out there in an online format in a curated way with a false face of your persona on, that any person in their right mind that sees that should reject you, because you're obviously not that person. And of course, some parts of you are. And that just, it terrifies me to see the online dating stuff. Another element you talked about was pornography, or the ubiquity of pornography being something that now is a part of sexual development for people. That wasn't something, right? We had nudie magazines, and that was part of male sexual development, was being exposed to those things growing up. But I grew up in a very cloistered, non-denominational evangelical community. Paul's actually the one that told me it was evangelical. I just grew up, it was church. I had no idea what that meant. So now I actually understand. I'm like, Paul, what do you keep saying, mainline and evangelical? What is this? And so he took me aside and he was like, James, you grew up in an evangelical church, and that's not like the church you go to now. It actually explained a lot. But I think that what was super interesting for me is that I grew up in that, similar to Cassidy, an environment that was very regimented, very much about purity culture, which we didn't know it at the time. We didn't call it that at the time, but the messages were so ingrained in us. The fear that was instilled in us, like Joey's talking about with pregnancy, STDs, that was, so that was the secular side of it. From the Christian side of it, there was a virginal aspect to this that was so paramount to, I mean, pregnancy is good, right? STDs, we have medicine. But there was this paramount nature that was placed onto the virginity issue that just, I think, is so many people are coming back to. And, you know, I'm a statistician. And so when I look up the stats in 2010, 5% of brides were married and had not had what we don't call it virginity anymore. We call it your sexual debut, which is way worse than virginity, but that's the new name. It sounds like you're on stage, like jazz hands and everything. But that
where is this the new name? Where is this the new name? I've never heard this one.
Sex research. So
okay.
like if you're doing research on this, you don't go in and type like scholarly articles for virginity. Look for sexual debut, which is it's classic, right? It's hilarious.
We'll bring back the debutante balls, but we'll do it in a non-patriarchal way. So that'll be how we escape that. Whatever.
But I went away from the church. I went into college, right? I had been in this cloistered environment. I went away from the church after college and in grad school. And I went away from the church. I didn't go away from my faith, but I went away from the church, and it felt really good. And part of the consequence of that was I had dated all non-Christian girls growing up. And that was something that was really something that bothered my parents and bothered everybody around me and bothered me as well, because there's this sort of impetus that you're not supposed to date somebody who's outside of the club. And that was another issue for me. And what ended up happening is, so I dated atheists, I dated non-theists and agnostics, and then I met my wife, and I figured that the only way to bridge the gap was to marry a Unitarian Universalist. So I did. And, you know, it's funny to see the difference in our cultures growing up and the messages we get. But I will say this, I'm desperate for a conversation about how do we continue sex education past that point at which people begin to develop sexually with one another in an intimate setting, and do it frankly and openly, because I think what we hear from the secular side, which is wear a condom or you'll get pregnant or you'll get STDs. We don't call them STDs anymore, they're called STIs, but that is fearful, right? Fear-based. You don't want an STI, you don't want a baby. And then there's the Christian side, which had this, and this again, Paul helps me to understand the history of the church. In the Seekers movement, I think is where purity culture really got a big push. And they had this very big emphasis on your value as a Christian based on your status as a virgin. And those two things are incommensurate with human sexual development, specifically young adult human sexual development. And we need to have a big come to Jesus talk, I'm using that colloquial term, about how do we support young people going through sexual development, make sure that they don't put themselves in a situation that they avoid something that would be a good thing for them to do, like marriage, like intimate relationships, and that they see the trap they're in with the online dating formats.
Yeah, so something you said, James, when you were talking about the way that you had the purity culture, where it was like this was the secular and this was the religious. I had this weird hybrid where it was like, well, sex is a really great thing, but in marriage, and like, don't have babies outside of marriage, you're gonna get STDs. And like, there's this weird dynamic of like women too, of sort of being this like, almost like the and not always, I think it gets exaggerated, but like women being the sexual gatekeeper of like, men are visual creatures. And so you gotta not wear tank tops, and you gotta, don't make your shorts too short, and, like find ways to not get yourself in a situation. And
I also saw that now as a way to teach them how to wield a power that they have in a social exchange over men, right? That actually
Right.
becomes a power game that I didn't see at the time. And it was couched in this, you should not make your brothers in Christ stumble. But
right.
it really was an awakening to the woman of what they could do and how they could command attention.
Right. Go ahead, Joey.
It's an incredibly powerful tool, and women should be aware, like women and young girls should be aware that they have it, and they should be taught to use it responsibly. And I'm not putting that with anything else. I don't know what the right way to do that is. I have no idea. But when you have that level of power, the Spider-Man thing is, it comes with a great level of responsibility. And I definitely see the popularization of wielding that weapon around in an irresponsible manner. And I think a lot of the cultural trends that the more famous right-wing personalities, for lack of a better term, a lot of the things that they get upset about is the trivialization of those physical tools that women just have and men just don't.
Right. And I don't think that those things were bad necessarily. I think there's a wisdom in like teaching modesty and teaching the differences between way men and women operate. But like James was saying, what I've realized in the last couple of years, that the spirit in which that it was taught was sort of in the same sort of secular view of transactional sex, where it's like, save this for someone else and give to someone else, as opposed to understanding what is sex in the spiritual context, what is the biblical context, and how does marriage and sex together like show the beauty of God and the way that humans are truly supposed to be. And in the last couple of years, I've seen even people who are in the purity movement try to pivot that, where it's not this fear-based thing, but it is more aimed at trying to show how we manage sexuality well, because of the power that is wielded by sexuality by both sexes.
It's clear that there's sort of two contexts we're dealing with here. One is the church, where I think my impression is, so in the Christian Reformed Church, we have a major report that, because we've had 2 synods canceled because of COVID, will come to Synod 2022. It's a major report dealing with not just questions of same-sex marriage, but human sexuality, and a whole menu of ways in which churches have sort of tried to bring some order to the chaos that seems to be out there outside of the church. And so there's sort of two different things to address. I think one would be people who don't identify as Christian. They don't go to church. They're not a part of any specific, let's say, cloistered community like a Christian community, where there might be different sets of rules. And then I see, so there's evangelical and mainline, and there's lots of different permutations too. There's also, Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox. I see on the church side of things a lot of sort of fear, defensiveness, or abdication. A sense that in the church side, I don't think a lot of people are very satisfied with how the church has approached this. And I see the outside the church side, it looks, there's sort of a therapeutic aspect, but this could get into some of the question that James asked me in one of the question and answer 2 weeks ago. I mean, the therapeutic side of it tends to be, well, do what will satisfy you or work for you. But that working for you as an individual is disconnected from any kind of community that says this is what shalom or well-being looks like, and this is how we pursue it as a
I'm
community
going to interrupt.
out there.
I'm going to interrupt you
Yeah, go
because
ahead.
I think it's one step worse than that. Like that would be an improvement if they said, do whatever feels good for you. What they tell you is don't feel guilty about absolutely anything you do. So
Wow.
whatever you go out and do, you are not breaking any rules at all, except it's very dangerous. There's no rules, but it's dangerous. So
But some people won't even say it's dangerous, and some people say the only rule is consent. So as long as you get consent, let your freak flag fly, do what you're gonna do, nobody's hurt. And that's just not, I just don't even think that's true when you look at the science and the way that it can affect mental health or, you know, certain things. And they're trying to, I think both the secular and the Christian are pulling to these extremes, and it's not helpful in the way of how do we understand sexuality, relationship, marriage, and the way we should pursue those things.
And for all of Cassidy's and James's complaints about kind of the structure that they were given, which any structure is going to be imperfect, that's just how it is, but they at least both had a starting point from which to diverge. And that gives you a much better ability to triangulate where you are and what risks you're taking. Where I would say in my dating experience, again, because I was meeting people online, and the first step of that was looks and not many other things. And I had a very, you know, diverse group of friends, which is there's definitely positives to that. But one of the negatives of it is, as far as courtship goes, is you don't know what the other person's rules are, and you're too young to verbalize all the rules yourself, because you don't know how to. You can play the game before you know the rules to the game, but if neither of you know the rules to the game, or you have two completely different sets of rules in your heads and neither of you can verbalize it, you're just going to hit a ton of friction. And when you're young and there's, you know, alcohol becomes available at 21, or really at probably about 18 or 19, but like when those things become available, you can still have a lot of fun with somebody, and that's important too. But the level of intimacy, that emotional intimacy, I think is something that a lot of people don't have access to. And the raising the level of emotional intimacy is one of the most rewarding things you will do in your life. I'm pretty confident in saying that. I'm not sure about much of what people should do with their lives, but finding both friends and social group and working on your family and finding an intimate partner with which to be with which to achieve a high level of emotional connection, that's what life is, as far as my estimation goes.
You know, that sounds terrifying to me. That sounds like marriage is terrifying then. The frame that I take is, because this is a chaotic world where you have two sides saying both things are terrifying, right? Emotional intimacy might be, because of your context, not something that you're ready for or can handle. And yet marriage could still be something that's very, very important and good for you and stabilizing. I think the real word has to be commitment. And you see all sorts of people that are committing to things, and people that commit to things find meaning in them, and they find their meaning in their commitments. And this is something from as long as we've had human history, people have done this type of commitment that you can't possibly know about, right? I've been married for 14 years, and I'm a different person than I was 14 years ago. She married somebody else. I married a different woman. And if you think about that, that's terrifying. You'll never do it. But what's so radical about a marriage is this commitment thing. There is such freedom in it that kind of fear of that commitment actually opens you up to a complete freedom to actually be yourself, to not walk around wearing masks for people, to be known intimately, to engage that emotional intimacy. And people don't know that because we're not telling them, you're not committing to who that person is now. You're committing to something that's bigger than yourself, and you're going to stick with it. And this isn't a diet. This isn't a lifestyle. This isn't a new workout on your Peloton. This is it. You're in, and it's over. You're done. Within that commitment, you become so free to be yourself. And I feel like it's
I believe you, and I believe that's true for you, but I don't think that that the idea that there's just a commitment out there and that everyone agrees what that is a reality for people my age and younger.
Well,
And
let Catherine get in here. Go ahead,
I
Catherine.
think that thanks. I think that part of what's happened is we've had boundary negotiations for a long time. You've had the secular culture saying we don't like these boundaries. Those are religious, we aren't, get rid of them. Then you have Christian people trying to fortify boundaries. What hasn't been happening is a really clear articulation of what actually would a commitment be a commitment to, what is a positive vision of marriage. What would that be for, say, and I don't even want to say the secular community, because I'm like, America itself is vast. There's many countries that are not American that are secular. So what would that be within a local community that community sees as marriage? And then within various church contexts, what would they see as marriage? But you don't get a clear presentation of what is a positive vision for marriage, and not positive as in like a good vision, but not a negative vision. Not saying, well, we're not sleeping with other people and we're not bored and we're not, that's the negative vision, all the things we're not, but building up a positive vision, because how can you commit to something if you don't know what you're talking about? And to Joey's point, if people aren't on the same page for what they're agreeing to, and on top of that, having a community that supports that, because just two people committing to that in isolation of a community, the likelihood that that will be successful is incredibly low. So.
Well, and I kind of want to add on top of that, because I want to say that as much as I can be contrarian about the purity culture and say things weren't right, I'm grateful. I'm incredibly grateful to have grown up in that and had that standard ingrained in me young, because I think it saved me, whatever traumas I got from it, from going through it, it saved me from, I think, worse traumas being on the other side of the extreme. But I think there is a conversation of like, how do we commit and how do we teach young people to be good at understanding the right thing to commit to? Because like, I look at myself, I was 21, I did it all right according to the evangelical culture. I waited till I was 21 and I dated my friend who I knew for 6 years, and we dated for 3 years with, the right sexual standard and trying to be serious about those things. And it came to a place where it was like, it all sort of fell apart. And it was like, if we had gotten married, I don't think we would have gotten divorced, but I think that the deconstruction that was seated within those things would have happened within the marriage, and that would have been very difficult. And I had to face the fact that was like, on paper, me and my fiance were like the right fit, and it was a good bet to commit to. But underneath this facade of what he was questioning his faith, even though he wouldn't say it. And I was openly questioning my faith, but more committed to it. And so it was this thing of like, if we would have entered marriage, that would have been a really hard life. And I always was raised with, love is not just a feeling, it's a commitment. And that's very true. But just, that idea of just because you love somebody doesn't mean you should be with them or should commit to them. And I think what I learned through that relationship, because I think I was committed even after it ended, to trying to find a way to make that work together. And I was fighting a battle that I shouldn't have. Like, I don't think we were really meant to commit to each other. And I think by the grace of God, whatever happened pulled us apart. And so it's like, what does it mean to figure out what you need to enter a commitment, and what's responsible for a commitment, and what do you really believe? Like, those things are really important when coming to a partnership and a marriage. And what is like the mission that you feel like you're called to in life? Those are all things that are really important, that you're kind of like handed this cookie cutter idea of like, in evangelicalism at least, of like what a good marriage is. You get married young and you have a bunch of kids and you go to church, and it's this like White House sort of thing, but it's also complicated and different. And just because somebody calls themselves a Christian or says they're in the same faith belief as you, it doesn't mean that that's true. And even if someone really believes that, maybe they haven't gotten to the place where they've done the work to question those things. And I think a lot of people, especially my generation who were young, they were rushed into marriage because they didn't want their kids to have sex outside of it. You know, if you love each other, just marry. Like, commitment's hard. You got to work at it. Just go get married. It was like, it works for some people, but it's also a recipe for some really weak foundations. And we're setting up like kids and young adults to enter marriages that are not strong and built on a solid foundation that's going to help it last.
Is that foundation possible without actually a stronger community around them? Because another watershed in this conversation is marry young versus marry later. And okay, so maybe you're both on the same page when you're young, you're both deciding to be committed Christians, but as James says, decades go by, someone might leave the faith. And then where are you? And, I really hear what Joey is saying. I think in the United States, there was more of a common culture that had, okay, this is what the commitments are. And the entire culture, as it were, sort of leaned in and gave some support to those commitments. Everybody understood there are bad marriages out there. People understood that there are hard marriages and that bad things happen in the lifetime. But I don't know, marriage young, marriage old, and so many other things. James, you talked about this in our question and answer with respect to, there's so many education expectations on people now. These questions are seriously disrupted, and just the diversity of perceptions out in the culture seem to say, well, maybe there's not, maybe this is an unrealistic goal. I hear that a lot.
I shared that the average age of first marriage has precipitously gone up. And my thoughts were, I don't know why that is, but my thought is that there is a tremendous amount that people are now needing to know and to do and to be qualified as to enter the other adult roles like work and career. And so that delays things. Paul, I looked it up because I told you average age that men get married now is 30. I looked it up. When you were in college at Calvin Seminary, it was 25 years old. That's the average age at first marriage for men back then. And so that's a big difference.
Yep. I was married at 25. My wife was just about to turn 22. Go ahead, Cassidy.
I would say I always expected to get married very young. Like that was my expectation. Like 21 to 23, I'll probably get married or whatever. And I was on target to do that until everything fell apart. And I'm actually really grateful that I didn't, because I look at the life now and what I've been able to explore and build, and think I couldn't have really done that well if I wasn't married. And, I think I would have rushed something, but I don't necessarily think it's a one size fit all scenario. I think there's a lot of young people who get married very young, and they've got a better foundation, whether it's their family or they just take things more seriously, and they'll be just fine, and they'll probably go through issues, but it's not going to be a big thing. But then there's plenty of people who I've seen get married young who I've been very hesitant to be like, oh, so great. It's like, I don't think you know what you're getting yourself into. And so
you show up at the wedding with kind of a face like,
yeah, you're like, ugh.
Do you think part of this is because we've raised a generation of maximizers, that we have so impressed to people, you have to go out there and set the world on fire and have the top job? Whereas I think, it's not released yet, a very interesting conversation with Rafe Kelly, where he talked about the fact that when generation after generation after generation, the job you're going to have, because you're going to work on the farm just like your father did, or you're going to keep doing these things because this is what everyone else did. So get a wife, have some kids, you'll have a life. But now at a very young age, we push children into, you've got to change the world. I mean, I went to a Christian high school, and the general usually the graduation talks were about following Jesus and giving your life to the Lord and yada, 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 yada. When I go to secular schools, public schools, and I listen to their, commencement addresses, and the colleges are even worse. You've got to go out there and you've got to fix the world. It's like, wow. Setting the bar high, aren't we? And if you're
You can't
going to
even
do
change
this,
your oil if you're going to fix the world. You can't.
and so then you need, when I listen to Catherine about people saying, I don't know if I want to, I want to have a kid. So on one hand, you have sort of a garden variety hedonism. That means I want to have my most enjoyable life possible. And secularism plays into this because I got one shot at this. This is the best chance I have. I wed myself to some idiot partner who's going to have some train wrecks in his or her life. And yeah, I can get out of it, but then that messes with the kids. And so, my best shot at my best life means being single and getting what I want. Very selfish, hedonist thing. At the same time, your moral matrix is go out there and save the world. And I guess they're supposed to be the same thing. And I think we give people this, and it's like kids, marriage, and anyone who's been married knows marriage is complicated and kids are complicated. So maybe on other terms, we're just setting young people up for failure with this stuff.
I mean, there's the answer, Paul. All we need to do is teach kids how to find a spouse that together will unlock their secret magic abilities that they'll both save the world. And that's all we got to do. There's a joke from an old comedian. It's like, all I'm looking for is somebody who's nice, and it was a female comedian, nice and tall and kind, and has the other half of this magic amulet. And like that. Yeah, it's not going to be like that. There's probably a little bit too much romanticism, which that used to be something that was reserved for the incredibly wealthy and elite. And so I think that's what the many people with the same jobs going over time. It's like, okay, we know the status of that person's father. We probably know that person's son will be one level higher or one level lower in status. So we kind of know what we're getting. We're told now not to evaluate people that way. And part of that's probably good, part of that's probably not. If you have somebody who's way off of you in terms of personality or way off of you in terms of intelligence or values or whatever, that's probably not a strong relationship. But at the same time, then your experience was, I'm going to go to a college where most of my peers will have a similar set of ideals to me. And that's probably, and we see that at incredibly elite schools as well. Ivy League schools still have a very high rates of people meeting their eventual husband or wife at college or in their master's program, et cetera. I went to a state school, which was a perfectly fine, decent school, but it was on the lower end of test scores and things like that. And, we had diversity, and diversity is great, but when there's too much diversity, it's really hard to pick a set of principles or a set of score, for lack of a better word. That sounds so banal, but I don't mean it that way. But like, how do you find somebody who is your relative equal when there's so many different ways of evaluating that person? And then I think a lot of us, I do think people are generally more kind and more open and more accepting than they used to be. And I do think that's a good thing. But it gets into that problem of discernment. How do we discern? How do we choose?
Catherine, did you want to get in? You got all these 4 Americans here. You're going to, you can't, there's not a lot of room for politeness, Canadian politeness.
Well, maybe I'll have to pick up on some of Cassidy's disagreeable nature and try to push a little more. Well, to your original question, like what's better for marriage, young or old? I think it's very easy to make the biological case that younger is better. Obviously, the fact that that is ideally true doesn't change anything right now. It might change things in terms of what we encourage younger people to do. But we need to have society, at least smaller communities, structured so that those people who are engaging in marriage at a young age are both agreeing to the same thing. There's common expectations, common goals. So I think that's the ideal. I think it's better if we move back in that direction. I think there's a lot of changes we would have to make as a society to make that viable and realistic. I think that, oh, I lost my thought. Joey had said something really interesting.
So
I'll
Joyce
tell
has
you
a
if
lot
I
of
remember
interesting
it.
You're gonna have to be more specific now.
True.
Well, and I, Catherine, your point is so important about, say you opt for the young marriage side. Again, I feel like there was sort of a container that afforded the path for younger marriage to sort of, this is what you're getting. And you can look across the table and at least know that the person you are starting on this trek with has been formed with a lot of the same, if one person is like, I'm down for this till the bitter end, and the other person is like, I'm here until it doesn't work anymore, there's going to be some problems.
I remembered my thought.
Oh,
I'll just throw it in quick, Cassidy. I think another giant shift in our culture is that I think it used to explicitly be taught across the spectrum that the primary goal of your life is to improve your character and virtue. Like building your character and building someone up, marrying someone of character, and together using your marriage as a vehicle to greater character and to become someone of virtue was the goal. And I think that happened. I'm sure there's a historian who can disagree with me, but I think most cultures had that as the ideal. And now I think the ideal is what you were saying, Paul, which is enjoy your life. It's short, it's harsh, get little bits of pleasure where you can, and don't let anyone get in the way of your happiness, because this is your shot. And who cares if you have virtue or not? That's other people's judgments. That's their problem. Get off my back. I've only got a dozen good years and my body breaks down, and I'm going to enjoy it while I can. And then once I no longer have access to the carnal pleasures the way I could in my 20s, then maybe I'll settle for marriage and hope maybe there'll be some other things that I could find pleasurable now that I've squeezed every drop out of these more base, enjoyable things. So the entire vision of what makes a life good has shifted so wildly that we have to even regain some of that more universal, like virtue and character is what makes a partner good, what makes a marriage good, what makes a life good.
That speaks a bit to the cultural shift in cohorts, in generations. And Paul was talking about that. You're going to change the world sort of aspect that the baby boomers kids all went out and told their children, you're going to all change the world. You're going to be this, incredible thing. And they were right. They absolutely did. But when you take on that responsibility as an individual, again, it's terrifying and you're going to fail at it. Whereas I think you're talking about a much more wholesome perspective and a much more realistic perspective, Catherine, on life. And that's something we should be offering our children and our young adults, is telling them to develop their virtue, because that's so much more important than achieving a goal, than achieving some sort of arbitrary goal that's been set forth for you, probably because your parents wanted you to do it. And that's something that's available to everybody. If you have a virtue, that's going to be benefiting your entire community. So I think that's a really wonderful way to point us back towards something where we can have a unifying message to tell young people. My dad told me that I was going to change the world, and told me that all the time. And I was like, that's way too much pressure in my mind. And I was mad at him. And I achieve a whole bunch. I'm going all the way up the ladder, the academic ladder. I do my postdoc at Columbia, and my dad came to me after my first child was born, and he said, I told you so. And I didn't know what he meant by you're going to change the world until then. I had these fanciful ideas about it because I hadn't changed the world until then. I hadn't made something new. And that little struggle, right? That little sort of master to the mentee and mentor relationship of saying that, but that's with follow through relationship, right? He's able to
allow me to struggle through the things and then realize my place, and then to both for it and then also to show me that I'm limited, right? So it's a very good thing when we have older generations communicating to younger generations, even when they don't understand each other.
I really like what you said, Catherine, about, the seeking of virtue, because in a Christian context where it's not secularity means our focus is on, 0 to 80 or 0 to 100. In a Christian context, the idea was what this life is for is preparation for the next life. And what I'm not going to bring into the next life is my 501c3, my, the money that I make, the cars that I drive, the house, even the business that I build. What I am going to bring into my next life actually is my virtue and that which I have developed in my character, and also my children. I mean, those things in a non-secular context, these are the truly durable goods. And so then marriage, I mean, one of the so Tim Keller wrote this marriage book, and it's been a very popular one. And part of what that marriage book argues is that marriage is character formation. And lately I've been watching The Bachelor and The Bachelorette with my wife and my daughters. And for me, I just sit there and, I most of the time I listen to these people talk and I just think, I'm just in shock. And it's all this, oh, I want the best for you, and I want to be there so that your life can be great, and yada, yada, yada. And, oh no, I'm going to be there for your life. It's going to be great. And I'm thinking, there's so much compromise and exchanging, and just, I want the best school for my children. Okay. You got 3 kids. Are all those schools going to be in your city? Are you going to change cities for the best? I mean, life is full of so much complexity that I'll look at all these maximized. And of course, on The Bachelor, you've got the most beautiful men and the most beautiful women. And it's like, this is just, and then of course the show is just ginning up drama. And it's like, this is insanity.
I think I can throw a good point on that is, when does the show end? The show ends when they select somebody. When do Disney movies end? When the story is over and the partnership just begins. Like it hasn't even actually started yet. Go ahead, Cassidy.
Right. Well, this is the point that I was going to make before Catherine made her point, where it was like, what is the cultural media narrative that we're giving men and women? And this is something that I've advocated for as a filmmaker, as a person who's in these areas where we're creating content for people to consume. It's like, what are our children watching, and what are the narratives that are being, instilled in them as they watch these things? And The Bachelor is one of the things that like horrifies me and fascinates me all at the same time, because it's these real people and these real lives, and it's this narrative that so many young people watch that get this false idea of what marriage is. And when you're looking at media of what women want and what men want or should want at the ultimate goal, it's drastically different. Women have the Disney princess, find your true love, get married and be happy. And men have this sort of Casanova womanizer, be single forever, but not celibate. And so you've got these two worlds that are colliding, and nobody knows how to piece them together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing people marry so much later. You get that idea of marriage is awful, marriage is horrible. Not really in rom-coms, that's a more conservative view of marriage, but it's also this sort of perfect ideal person where it's like you have a meet cute, and then you have some drama, but then you figure it out, and then you get married and happily ever after. But in real life, that's just not the world that we know. Like our generation had far more families that were divorced than, the generation before us. And that scares them into marriage. And there's all of these things that it's like, this is what they're told they want. And there's something in them that wants that. But then there's this other thing where they've felt the burn of what that is, to either experience and live through a divorce or see a marriage that's not very happy. And it's really hard to figure out, what do I even want? And so you just put it off.
I kicked out James because he has a better beard than I have. So it's no more James.
Fair. Harsh but fair.
Well, what, I mean, what can be done about this? Joey asked, some of what I think people are going, I found there's a lot of interest in this topic of conversation on the Bridges of Meaning Discord. I think there's more interest in this conversation than people are willing to admit. And I think that is sort of fueled by intense interest in the shows like The Bachelor, and there's all sorts of reality shows on about this, and there's I think a high degree of anxiety in the culture, and so yeah, I don't know what kinds of well, James, you teach. What kinds of things do you say in your sexuality class? Do you give advice, or you one of these secular professors that just throws up statistics and says, "Figure it out, boys and girls," and all of those who care to identify as in other ways?
Well, you can go take all of my stats and my introductory psychology classes on YouTube right now. My human sexuality class,
The product
I have
placement.
made private because, teaching online, the thing about a human sexuality class is that things do come up that are more than just statistics and data. It's people in real life and choices. And so I'm always frank with my students, and I think that's probably why I get a good response from them, which is you choosing one thing or another is going to have a lot to do with the outcomes you see. And make those choices in your head and make yourself an authentic person, and don't make choices for somebody else. Make them for yourself and realize that there are consequences. When we get to the class and I introduce it, I say, hey, everybody thinks this class is going to be about how to wear a condom and avoid STIs and not get pregnant. And really, this class is going to be about how do you choose and maintain and grow a sexual relationship with yourself over your lifetime. And hopefully that's with a partner. And so people really lock onto that because they're really interested in that. No one's telling them that. I mean, half the secular stuff just says, use condom, use birth control. There's nothing in the secular modes that are saying, hey, limit the number of partners you have. Or what I always say, the most dangerous thing in a sexual relationship without marriage is going to be that you're emotionally attached to somebody that you're not committed to, and they can leave. And that's
that they're not committed to you.
And that's devastating. And I tell my students that you don't have to fear pregnancy. We all got here that way. It's actually really good. You don't have to fear marriage. Most people were married. You have to fear what's new, which is this emotional entanglement, this sense of dissatisfaction with yourself when you engage intimately with somebody and that relationship dissolves. And that's real. And it's shocking to people because that's not the message they get from our society.
Is the church then a haven in the storm, or is the church, I could imagine someone saying, hey, I want to marry someone who's got similar values to me, and I want to marry someone within a context that says, the church isn't gonna force you to stay married. The church doesn't have that kind of legal power. And in the Christian Reformed Church, a generation ago, the church gave up passing judgments on, well, this divorce was okay and this wasn't okay, because the church has become a voluntary society. You're on one hand, James, I think you're talking a lot of sense, because we have this, on one hand, this ethic of personal fulfillment, and we're giving people, and that tends to be where we're putting all of our energy, and this other ethic of this is what it takes to be the kind of person that someone else can count on. That's sort of the Jordan Peterson message, but there's not a lot of that in society, because that becoming a kind of person that someone else can count on involves a lot of self-sacrifice. That's almost the definition of it.
In I think it's Plato's Republic, they're describing the type of just society, right? And basically he just says, everything's temperance, everything's just moderate, everything's just a nice, normal life. And all I see us now is promising our young people this great, grandiose life. And the reality is if we want a just and a kind and a sustainable society, everybody has to be average. And no one's advertising that. No one's advertising you're going to be average, you're going to have an average life. And that's wonderful. And that's beautiful. And it has value. And there's virtue available. We're not giving people, my students don't hear this from professors. They don't hear it from their parents. Everybody's promising them the moon or Mars now. And we're not talking about day-to-day life and how we find the mundane is discarded now. And the mundane is transcendent.
I'm going to poke at you for a sec, James, and maybe this is a conversation for somewhere else, but I really don't like the phrase a sexual relationship with yourself. That bothers me. I completely agree with what you just said about embracing the value of the simple and the daily and the normal and the goodness in that. I love all of that. But I think one of the things that's essential in a healthy sexual relationship is that it's not just with yourself, that you are inviting the other, and that actually can be something that you are exposed to, open yourself to, and there can be really meaningful dynamics there. And I think if you don't have that, I almost feel like maybe we need more words or something, but anything that's just masturbatory is not that. And even if you're to frame it as your lifelong sexual relationship with yourself, I'm like, well, I guess I have that, but I think what I have with my husband is much more meaningful and different from that as well. So I might take a little exception to the terms.
I think maybe I didn't phrase it correctly, because what you just said I agree with. We also, if we want to talk about the messages that we get, yes, the sexual development is, you're going to start off as an alone person, right? Before you join somebody in an intimate relationship, you're going to be alone and by yourself. And what I mean about the sexual development of the individual is being honest with oneself about your goals, about your frailties, about, I have students, a lot of them can't even be honest about their experiences. And some of that's trauma related. Some of that's trauma related. Most of that is guilt and sadness and disappointment related. And so when I say developing yourself as a sexual individual, what I mean is being authentic so that you can be vulnerable in a sexual partnership with somebody, so that it can grow into something that's that transcendent. And I think I didn't phrase myself clearly when I described that. The masturbation thing's interesting too, because what are we to do with masturbation? What are we to tell people with masturbation? There's all sorts of people that are saying all sorts of different things about masturbation. And the reality is, we know people do it. We know people have always done this, and this is a normal sexual function. Why is the church so upset with masturbatory things? And I have my brother's a missionary, and we discussed this because we have very different views about something like this. And I said, well, how would you tell your kids masturbation's okay? Because I've got teenagers that are just coming up now, and how would you tell your kids that masturbation's okay or not okay? And we had a big, long conversation about it, because it's a really important thought. And I asked him this difficult question. If you have a committed Christian person who's in this saying, I'm going to wait until marriage, or I'm not going to do that, if they masturbated and they only thought about their potential partner, their wife or whatever, would that somehow be okay and not sort of this sinful nature of you're not withholding yourself? And I just thought that there isn't even a place in the church to have that conversation about the biological necessity of our being and the sexual development. I don't see anybody willing to have those conversations, because I'm saying, look, if it could be not what the problem is with masturbation, which would be sort of lust or something like that, and it was viewed in a different way, and it was couched with something of your vision should be that of Christ's relationship with the church in the future for you in marriage. That's still our message. And we recognize that you're a 23-year-old male who has a world full of sexual images. And if you could manage to have a healthy sexual image of the future wife you had, man, that'd be amazing.
It's James, one of the things that really struck me when we started our local meetup, and something that I've always given thought to as I've had my YouTube channel, is when we started our local meetup, I was profoundly moved by the fact that in our local meetup, we could talk about things in ways that the church just hasn't seemed to have found a way to do. And we are in a period of astounding changes at remarkable speeds. And I guess part of what I wanted for my YouTube channel was a place that we could have open, honest conversation to address things that, you know, I to have a conversation like even just what we're having here right now in a church setting. I'm sure it happens in some places, but I don't know. And that's I think part of why Christian communities are struggling with this, even though they come to it, I think, with a lot of advantages than non-Christian communities. The church has just not demonstrated a capacity to have these conversations. You can find books written about things. You can get to, let's say, Christian university level and find good discussions about things, but nothing that gets down to, you know, a lot of what Cassidy was talking about, and James too, in terms of how they're raised, and me to a certain degree too. Where can the church actually pull its things out and put them on the table and say, okay, let's take a look at this?
Yeah, the way that I see it, I think there's a couple problems with the way the church addresses sex. I think the biggest one is there's a fear. There's a fear behind all of that. People are afraid to talk about sex. They're afraid that their kids are having sex. They're afraid to share if they've had sex. There's all of these things where there's this fear with this sexuality question. So I think the first thing is like, we need to get more comfortable talking about sex. And I don't know how that works within the Christian context. I know that there are churches that are trying, and it's this experiment, but I think that's going to be the biggest starting point of like, let's get more comfortable talking about it. I think the second point is being more realistic about what the Bible really says about sexuality. Because, you know, if we're talking about that, I think for most people, there's a lot of Christians who would say that they think that masturbation is a sin, but the Bible's very silent on masturbation. And how do we operate within that, and what we're given to
except for poor
understand.
Onan.
Poor Onan, I know that
Poor
dude
guy.
raked over the coals.
Capital punishment. Not just blindness or hair on your hands.
No.
I'm sorry, Cassidy, keep going.
I just think that there's a certain level where there's a lot of us who grew up in the church and grew up in purity culture, where we were told what to believe but not why in a lot of areas. And so we have all of these like frames and these systems from like, this is what we believe. But then when we start to really question it, or we go out into the world and see other narratives, we don't have anything hard to stand on, and we don't know how to actually understand how we get to a why of something. And I think part of that is like, a lot of times we don't treat children like they can understand. We always try to dumb stuff down or like make it simple. And it's like, kids are smarter than we think. And yes, there are levels in which that we have to work as kids grow. But I think if we found a way to be more like on their level, especially as our kids get older into their teen years, and talk like more like they are like have some agency and are human beings trying to figure out this crazy thing called sexuality, and giving our perspective of what we've gone through in the past and talk through those things in a safe space, it would be a lot easier. Because like right now, kids have all these questions and they feel afraid to bring them up in churches. So they go to their friends and they go to the internet and they try to find out why they believe what they believe. And I think that's a more dangerous dynamic than to be able to have kids say, okay, just, what's your question? And be straight with them and let them know like, hey,
So
you have a place to talk.
I teach human sexuality in public. It's not a problem for me to say any of this stuff. And yet I have a 13-year-old, right? And so regardless of me being comfortable talking about it, there's a dynamic where it's very difficult. You said you want to make it easier. It's not going to be any easier. We have to do it, even though it's very hard. We have to keep that conversation going, specifically with our young adults, and not just with our kids. It has to be a cultural conversation. Every adult should be talking to their children about sex, about sexual development, about the morals that they want to promote in their family. But we as a culture have to bring it forth and become more comfortable with it, so that it's not this taboo thing. And then it's not this black box where you're going to somehow figure it out in marriage, or you're just going to go off and do your own secular thing with your intimate partners. We have to be more open that it's not working the way that we've instantiated currently.
Well, and I would say that in the broader culture, it's not exactly a taboo topic. Like, that's a preferred topic, I think, in the broader culture. I don't think there's any issue talking about sex, masturbation, fetishes. Like, that's not an issue. I think, you know, Cassidy is obviously representing what's genuinely a subculture within the church. But as a broader culture, I don't think that's the issue at play. I think the larger issue is we've become so fixated on boundaries within the church to maintain them, outside of the church to push against them, that we've lost a clear articulation of what would the metaphysic of a healthy sexual relationship actually look like, so people know what they're aiming for on either side of the aisle. And I think to articulate the metaphysic of that and move towards that would actually resolve a lot of the boundary issues, because that automatically would set your salience landscape, pop your frame into place, and now people are moving in a direction. You have a reason for why boundaries are where they are. But without a well-articulated metaphysic of what is a healthy sexual relationship, how do you establish that, who do you need to be, and what postures do you need to take on to be able to enact that, you don't have a way to form anything. So you're just left with boundaries, and then you're stuck without having a helpful conversation with your 13-year-old or any other kid, because you're just telling them what to do or not do.
You know, it's interesting. I work in comedy, and with stand-up comedians, mostly sort of C and B levels, people working their way up to try to get more successful. And so there's a lot of blue comedy that goes on there. And there's a certain level which, yeah, talking about sexuality in a certain frame is comfortable. But then there's other places where it really isn't. And I heard, I think it was the Virgin Bachelor, whatever his name was. He said something like, nobody cares about your sex life unless you're not having it any. And like, I have found that within those cultures to be true, because you'll talk about it on stage or whatever, but then nobody really talks about it off stage, except that you assume everybody's having sex. But because I'm more traditional and have a Christian sexual ethic where I'm not having sex before marriage, you know, I'm still a virgin and all of these things, all of a sudden that's the topic of conversation. Everybody cares why about that. And so it's sort of this interesting thing where you're like, oh, you're all open and free. And then all of a sudden it's like, what? And I haven't felt shame for it, actually. And I think it's probably because I'm older. I get a lot of people saying, good for you, man. Like, do you, girl, or whatever. But like, when I was younger, I was made fun of all the time of like, oh, you're stupid. I'm like, okay, whatever. I don't care what you think about me. But there is this sort of weird frame where it's like sometimes sex is okay, but then I feel some people feel uncomfortable talking about sex with me. I don't care. I'm pretty comfortable around it. I'm not easily offended. And it somehow makes this weird dynamic. And I think it's because people don't really know what they're swimming in. They don't have a lot of frames. And it's hard when someone does feel like they have a frame to swim in, and they accept that.
What do you, we're a half hour away from 2 hours. What for you, it's interesting that we went from marriage very much over to sex, which is, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a very interesting thing in this, because marriage is of course a much bigger thing than just simply sex. And, you know, I really enjoyed the question about, you know, I think, James, after you rephrased it, because I think the first way you phrased it very much did kind of lead in a masturbatorial direction, as Catherine noted. But you're really talking about how to steward one's sexuality through an entire lifetime. And I really like the way this conversation went in terms of, you know, without a metaphysic, the very specific questions about, oh, how ought one to spend their life? Is it, Christianity, of course, has the Apostle Paul, who basically makes the comment, hey, if you really want to follow Christ, you can sort of not burn with passion, forget about marriage and focus full time on that, on that mission for God. And of course, the history of that in the Christian church, Roman Catholic and then Protestant, has been a fascinating whole other topic. So maybe what I'd like to do is kind of go around the group and ask you, what for you are the most important questions either the dominant culture or the church really needs to wrestle with respect to marriage?
Can you repeat the question?
Well, what are the big questions that we have to wrestle with? I mentioned one earlier about marrying young versus, marrying almost midlife right now. I mean, 30, especially for women, you're marrying in your 30s. I mean, Catherine got right down with the motherhood part, but if you're marrying in your 30s, people are like, not a lot of time to wait here. So what are the big questions for you that as a culture or within the church, we really need to deal with in terms of this marriage crisis?
I'll go last because what I'm going to say is going to tip over this apple cart. So
cool. All right,
So
good.
I'll start with society needs to respect that the tradition is here and has evolved over time to be good for humans, even if they don't take the spiritual side of it. It's better for people. Statistically, you live longer, you report you're happier. Children raised in a marriage relationship end up succeeding in so many more areas. So we have to come to terms with that it is good for people. Even from that well-being side, it is good for people. So we should be promoting it. And why we're not is really showing how vulnerable our cultural narrative is currently, which is saying pursue that individual thing. And that's not actually going to be best for you in the long haul, right? That's that immediate gratification idea. From the church side of it, I really do want to promote that church leaders begin to open up talking the uncomfortable conversations about young adult sexuality as Christians. If they don't have those conversations, what ends up happening is that people are hurt by the purity culture, people fail at the purity culture who would have been served by the purity culture, and people are confused when they get into an intimate relationship about what it actually means from a physical standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from a relational standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. So if we don't open up and talk to young adults about all of that, then the church is abdicating its position as the spiritual leaders within the conversation of marriage. Now, when we went back to, I think it was Proposition 8 here in California, where they legalized gay marriage.
No, where they made it illegal.
The voters of California made it illegal,
right?
Which I had a lot of problems with. I don't think that a secular government, can restrict rights from some of its citizens based on immutable characteristics. That's antithetical to me. Yet the church now is acting as though somehow they're bound by the same rules, and that's not where they derive the same morality surrounding the marriage relationship. And so they need to be very consistent with where they get their values from the marriage relationship, because if they get muddied, then our younger generations are not going to hold those values the same. I'm very glad that our government got right again and stopped restricting rights to equal citizens. That's the correct thing. What I really hope is that our church leaders are going to be open and honest about where their morality comes from, about what marriage means within the church in the future. And I know that's a lot.
Well, the apple cart, I don't know if it's still there, but we're waiting for Joey.
It.
So James throwing down.
Try now, Joey.
Okay, anybody besides Joey?
I could go next, but
no, Joey.
I'm
down for the expectations. So
I want to build off what James said, in that I think a big thing that, and I look at this from a church perspective because that's just the culture that I find myself in, and I think I'm in the secular world, but like, again, how they define those things is one thing. It's like, how am I going to live, and what do I think is the right belief, and which community am I going to put myself in that helps me best follow that right belief. So I think one thing is like, we need to separate this idea of what the secular idea of marriage is and what a religious idea of marriage is, because marriage is not just a piece of paper. And right now I think the church acts as if marriage is the same thing as the secular view, except it's this ticket to have sex. It's like, as soon as I sign that paper, that's it. Marriage is something incredibly different. And it's not just about sexuality, although that's a part of it. And I think that's something that the church really needs to reevaluate. And I think there's a lot of church leaders who haven't even totally thought through of that idea of like, what is really marriage in this like biblical level. And so that would be a big thing. And I think the other thing is really finding a way to encourage people that marriage is a good thing, but helping them count the costs of what that means to be married. It's instead of trying to sell it and market it as something to like trick kids into doing it because it's good for them. And also finding a way to help people who aren't supposed to be married still feel like they're part of its community. Because as a single who was interested in marriage, but wasn't really interested in playing the dating game that a lot of these evangelical churches sort of did, I found it really hard. Like, I found it really hard to really find a place to really have community. But I'm lucky that I'm very much a self-starter. So it's like, I knew I wanted it. And so I found it, and I kept searching till I kind of got it. But I think there's a lot of singles who are floundering. They feel like they're less of a person and they don't know where to go or have support. And they end up making mistakes because they just don't feel like they can do anything else. So that's sort of the spectrum of which I would like to see church change. And I think there are people doing that, which is a beautiful thing. And like, we're gonna make mistakes as we do it, but it's gonna take some time and some grace on both ends of the spectrum.
Okay. Catherine.
Well, I'll go before we get our apple cart tipped over. So I don't know if this is a very helpful answer, but I feel like, you know, very much the way Dominion sort of lays it out, we are sort of feasting off of the carcass of Christianity. There's still the rib cage and the bones, and there's enough structure that we're still making it okay. But within and outside of the church, I think the higher level questions that need to be answered in a way that scales up and down are, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be a human? And how do you accomplish such a thing? And why would you accomplish such a thing? I think that's the top question. Then when you drop down a level, it's, what is masculinity and femininity? How do those exist within a person? How do those exist within a unity of people? And then how does that exist within family and society? And then I think the question that doesn't follow as clearly logically, but I think is necessary for functional moving forward in this, is more, how do you develop a community in which a marriage would be supported and valued? How would that make sense within that? And how can you help people have a view of life that points throughout their life instead of just being fixated on, you know, 18 to 41? I feel like that is sort of where we see life in our current culture is happening. I've been thinking a lot about menopause. I'm still a little ways away, but I've been thinking a lot about the fact that, I might be wrong, but I think humans are the only female animals that actually go into menopause. And I see that as being a function of design, because the role of women ought to change as they age. And I don't think that there's almost any conversation about that. I think in our society, the ideal is to reach peak physical attractiveness and then maintain that, as if the role that you ought to play in your 20s, establishing marriage, establishing partnership, that is the role you should continue to live out through your lifespan. And there's not much of a thought given to the development of yourself as a person throughout your life. And that ought to be something that is mapped out as a society with clear mechanisms for how you would go through that and a valuing of each stage. So I think that conversation is one in which marriage gets nested into comfortably. And I see that on the Christian and non-Christian side, because I think the Christian community also highly values the 18 to 41-year-old lifespan and then just wants you to live that forever, and even sees that as heaven. You know, heaven is where you get to be 30 forever and be hot and beautiful, just not have sex with anybody. Like,
I know,
So-
Joey. She's doing a good job. You're gonna have to beat this one. Keep going, Catherine.
oh, I'm done. I think that's
That was really good. Wow, that was really good. All right, we had the big build up.
Well, and this is maybe not the best place to end, because what I'm going to say is, like, I don't like, my experience of this conversation is I feel like I was having a completely different conversation than everyone else. And I think the biggest reason I felt that way was because we jumped quickly to pop culture and sexuality. And if the church thinks it's going to win on pop culture or sexuality, you're not. Like, what is the church going to do to control sexuality? That cat's out of the bag. You don't control it anymore. Any individual within a church can leave the sexual norms of that church in America at any time for any reason they want to. And when they have that level of freedom, they're going to. I feel like people who talk about it in the context that we've discussed it today feel like the church is providing marriage and family and sexuality net, but it's not a net. I think it's more of like a chain. And as soon as one link in that chain breaks, the person who was on that chain is lost. And the way I think, because the question was, what can the church do to make this better? And I think what the church can do to make this better is establish a set of norms that give us something. What's the draw? Sell it to me, essentially. I know that sounds, again, I keep sounding so profane with this, and part of that is profane, but like, what's the draw of either commitment, find yourself and then find a partner, but stay a virgin until then. Like, I get the people who were born into that and can continue along that because their personalities were such that they lined up with those norms, and their existence didn't tell them to diverge from that. But as soon as somebody hits one obstacle that makes them want to diverge, I feel like the temptation is too much. And the way you counter temptation is not by saying, resist that temptation. There needs to be a better set of things provided. And I think compared to the church, a group of people who are doing a much, much better job at this, for all their faults, are Instagram moms. They're doing a much better job of selling marriage than the church is. A lot of them are church affiliated, but pictures, I know it's maybe not good for the individual, but pictures of their children, pictures of the joys of parenthood, pictures of the struggles of parenthood, the adventures that happen within a marriage, the adventures that happen within a couple that are, as a single person, completely unavailable to me. That would be something that would draw me. And pretty much everything else I've heard today, I can't picture a younger version of me. I can't picture a version of me that was born into the church. I can't picture any of those versions appealing to kind of the standard. I think Christianity has gotten into kind of a rut of trying to follow pop culture and copy it, and you're never going to beat it if you're just following. You have to give us people, young people, whoever, you have to give somebody something to strive towards. And I'm not seeing it, and I'm not seeing it talked about, or at least it's not making it to me somehow. And again, I'm saying this from the outside, so maybe I could be completely wrong, but that's maybe an interesting conversation too.
I do want to say something in response to that, because I don't disagree with you, Joey, but I will say that I don't think selling something is the answer, because I grew up being sold this purity narrative, and I look at these Instagram moms and I go, that's not real life. That's a counterfeit version of what this is supposed to be. I think the better thing to do is embody it. Like, older people, younger people, the people who have caught the vision, like learn how to embody those things. And that's going to give people a better vision of the reality of what that is than something else. And I've experienced this personally. I've dated several people who did not grow up in purity culture, who had no reason to believe that they would save themselves to marriage or be with someone who would. But by the way that I stood by my convictions and expressed my convictions and displayed the things that I learned through exploring those things, they told me that they found that something attractive to it in a way that they had never seen it before. And I think there's something to this fact where you're looking at these evangelical cultures where that model is sold, and it's get some people to do it, but I don't think it's always the healthiest thing. And it's the harder thing to do, like learn how to embody it and just let that speak for itself. But I don't think trying to like convince people and sell people on it is going to be the helpful thing, because people feel tricked.
I just want to say, Joey, how dare you? My apples are everywhere. I don't know how to get them. They roll into the bed. This is very upsetting. Give me my apples back.
Can I make mention of another Dr. James in our local meetup? He brought forth an interesting cultural variation, which is we don't have intergenerational households anymore. And that is a loss of role models, right? That's a loss of, why would we do that? Why would we go that next step of development when we don't have it in front of us? And what's being served to us is that Catherine and Paul are saying this 18 to 41-year-old sort of, which sucks because I'm 43. So that super sucks that I'm no longer cool.
I can hardly remember 43.
A couple years ago, I was really cool. But we don't have and this is Dr. James always said in his culture, that intergenerational household, there's a lot of passing along of subtle communications. And I'm not one who, I don't enjoy subtle communications. I want you to spit it out. But there's an embodiment of an expectation of what you should do through you're watching people grow and age together. You're watching them grow as your grandparents. If they're in the same household as you, you see marriage across time, right? If your older cousins are in your neighborhood, you see their marriage, their young marriage, and how attracted they are to each other, and how sicky sweet it is to be around them. It's just uncomfortable. And then you see them get annoyed with each other and fight, and then you see them have babies and not even talk to each other for weeks on end. But you're seeing it, and we're not seeing it in our culture. And that's the intergenerational perspective that's lost, is it's not being modeled for people. We live in our boxes and we don't go outside and live in community.
Well, and to be fair, I think that a lot of where stuff broke down was after World War II, right? People came back, a lot of dads with PTSD, a lot of dads with emotional problems, moms out working, dad sometimes can't because of that. Then I think you got Dr. Spock, who came in and said, hey, let's not be so harsh and distracted from our kids. Let's try to be a little more loving, which was then maybe open the doors too wide. So then Dobson came in and was like, no, some boundaries would be good and kids could use that. But I think that the part of why you don't get that modeling, you don't get that normative vision that I think Joey's saying, please give me the vision that I would actually want to move towards. I think it really got broken up about 80 years ago. And so now we've got to figure out how to put it back together in a way that would actually be attractive and desirable, because it should be. It should be attractive, or we're not getting it right.
Joey, I've got one question. What to you is, this could get a little dicey, but what to you is so attractive about these Instagram moms? I mean, there's kind of a funny question to that, but a serious side of it too.
Besides their butts, I
mean. I know. And I really love that Catherine said, it's like, 21 to 41, that's, but when you see that, what stirs in you?
I mean, there was the wholesome stuff, okay, maybe that didn't resonate me when I was younger, but at some point that started to resonate with me.
Mhm.
In terms of the intergenerational handoff, which is what we called the Zoom meeting invite. I'm not sure if it's what we'll call the video. We didn't really talk about that very much until James just brought it up. But James is referring to another friend of ours who's probably 10 years older than him. James is my only friend that's 10 years older than me. One of two, maybe. The other one is, he's kind of a, drifter is not the right word, but he's an unmarried man in his, early 40s. So I don't have any, I don't have any advice from him. He asked me for advice the other night about dating, and I don't know what to tell him. So for me specifically, part of the Jordan Peterson phenomena was, there might be something beautiful in the wholesome and personal. And then the group itself, the thing that most made marriage look attractive to me and a worthwhile endeavor was comparing the older men. And so I'm to any of the younger men who are watching us, I use me as an example and an example of failure in some sense, because I'm in my mid-30s and I did not focus enough when I was younger on finding a lasting relationship. And now I wish I did, because I am jealous of James's life. He's got, from what I can tell, a solid marriage, a good family. Nothing's ever perfect. That's of course true. I'm jealous of your life, Paul. Like, I'm jealous of people who had access to do the great adventure that is life and are doing it through the relationship that's personal and has some level of permanence to it. And my day-to-day experience does not include that. A lot of that probably does have to do with my job as well. A lot of it because I work temporary. So a lot of my life is very ethereal. It goes down my timeline and then it goes into the past. And that's not a way to live, people. Like, young people, like, if you're watching this, like, that's not a way to live. Start building something in your life. I'm going to tell people, start trying to build something in your life that'll last. And one of the most valuable things you can do, and I'm just using this from the experience of other people in my life that I've seen over decades grow. It's that personal relationship and hopefully a family from it. The family might not work out for everyone. It might end in tragedy, because it often does, but you have to try.
Yeah. Well, I think just on the other end, I spent my whole life being very conscious of marriage and what it means and being serious about it. And I'm 28 and still not married. And I don't regret doing that at all. I think it was the better path, but I do think that there's a certain level of like idolization of the trad wife, where it's like the wholesome 60s thing. And I hear a lot of people talk about, I want a trad wife. And it's like, okay, yes and no. And it's like, and I think that's where I had a lot of trouble in evangelicalism, where I'm highly traditional in certain ways, but I am not a trad wife. I'm not the traditional sort of look of like that Instagram mom. And I think that's okay. And I don't look down on someone who is, but I think there's just this balance of like, there's the risk of idolizing that makes it hard for people pursuing realistic marriage as well.
Christians look to Jesus as an example, and that's pretty high up too. And I'm not saying Instagram models are Jesus, but there's a level of what are you going to idolize? Like what? Again, this is not an attack on you, but like I think you're taking what I'm saying and saying I'm saying purity culture is a good thing. That's not what I'm saying. Purity, that whole purity movement seemed to me like a cartoonish caricature of what actual relationships look like. Because as somebody who designs incredibly complex systems, you had a couple people who designed a system that they thought was incredibly simple, and turns out it's not. And that's where I get the chain to net analogy. So.
Right. And I mean, I'm not trying to, I think what a lot of what you say, there's wisdom in it. I think I'm just putting my 2 cents in that there's a balance. And like when you're talking about Jesus, yeah, I designed my life around Jesus. But what I realized from 18 to now is that the Jesus I was given and sold in sort of the popular evangelical culture is not the Jesus I find in the Bible. And so like Jesus is good and there's parts of that that are true, but you have to recognize like, what am I being sold and how am I consuming the things that doesn't idolize something that isn't real? And that I actually don't think that the purity culture is bad necessarily. I think there should probably be reform, and like there was definitely places that were misguided, but I think for as much pain as it caused some people, I think it gave a lot of people a better chance of having like a life that is worth living. But there's balance. So I don't disagree with anything you're saying, and I think there is something like is something appealing to the, you know, the traditional wife that otherwise it wouldn't be able to be idolized. But you have to find the balance and realize that's not just what it means to be a good wife or a good Christian. There's something more. And a lot of those Instagram moms and these Instagram couples, they're not being authentic. Some are, but there's a lot that aren't. And that's just as dangerous to buy into a fake ideal than to not buy into it at all.
It's really interesting to me how I think in some ways maybe part of what the church is going to have to look at is to sort of be a place on the other end of people having tried out a lot of things. Churches are pretty good at that, actually. Churches tend to pick up, you know, one of the things, I have a lot of seniors in this church, but not all of these seniors have been in the church for 50 years. I've baptized multiple people in their 70s. And I think part of what came into that was people having tried a lot of things in their life and getting to the point of saying, that stuff didn't work. And now in your 70s, it's a different story, but people grabbing it there. I really valued from what so many of you said. And part of the reason I knew this group was going to be a good group was because, all this low and agreeableness, and the most agreeable person was said the most disagreeable thing tonight. I love that. And she's a Canadian, Colin. Yeah. Although Dr. James gets into big fights in our local meetup too. There was, I won't go into the one big battle that James had with,
I don't remember which one. There were so many.
That's true. That's very true. But I thought this was super helpful, and I really want to. I mean, this is why I love having Joey in conversations like this, because Joey is going to tell us exactly what's on his mind, and so often in the church there are too few people doing that. Often for some very good reasons, but that level of honesty. It's interesting to me. I sort of look at what Joey said about the Instagram mom, and I also am really impacted by what Catherine said about this time thing, and sort of taking Catherine's point about the time thing and James's point about, we're not actually helping young people plan for a lifetime. I think part of that has to do with sort of this denial of death. One of the most, on my blog, which I started long before I ever did YouTube, one of the most common hits that people get at is I copied and pasted the romantic solution from Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, which is something that I picked up from a Tim Keller sermon. He basically talks about the fact that part of what society did in secularization was take the romantic ideal and pump it up so high that this romantic image now becomes the most potent image or idol that one tries to navigate for. And that's what we see in a show like The Bachelor. And even Becker's point as a secularist was, this idol is going to betray you. because it is not a sufficient goal that one can actually navigate their life around. Life is larger than this, and institutions need to recognize that and not just say anybody after 40. How old are you, James? Anyone
42.
Okay, anybody after James's age, maybe they can make a lot of money, but their goal is to try and keep look as good as they were, so that, when they go off into, I just watched a documentary about, was it you, Cassidy, who recommended this to me, this documentary about the village in Florida, this huge senior community. Well, it's
No, that was
crazy.
me.
But no, this has been terrific. Any takeaways from each of you on what you got out of tonight, and maybe, other things you'd like to talk about in the future connected to this?
Well, I'd certainly like to talk with preferably the whole group, but at least James, about Sachs, about what he thinks we should be doing in terms of equipping young people. I would love to talk more about what a helpful and realistic normative vision of marriage would be. Sort of what could that be that could navigate between the unhelpful idealization, but grabbing a hold of, we should have a beautiful vision of what a life should look like, and that, I hope, for the sake of humanity, will include marriage and children and an old age that is dignified and enjoyable and generative. So I would hope to have that conversation. I think I would like to hear more from Joey about what he is wanting. I'm like, my apples, they're everywhere. I would like to know what is the cart and how can I put my apples back in it? Because I feel like maybe I'm not tracking with the question as well as I would like to. So I'd like to maybe hear that more clearly articulated so I can engage with that better. And I do think that an ongoing conversation about, okay, this has been sort of gathering pieces, but what are some practical questions that we could actually start answering? Like, what are ways for people who are still looking for a relationship to move forward? What would that look like in various contexts? If you haven't been able to do that, what are the things that you ought to be developing within yourself? And is that even connected to marriage or not? So some of those more practical questions I would enjoy pushing back into.
Great. Thank you. It's good. Anyone else? Takeaways, wish list for further conversations?
This was fun. I just enjoyed this so much. I find each of you incredibly intriguing, and that makes me want to hear more people, maybe on the Discord, kick around this stuff. We're kicking it around. We haven't, like Catherine said, we haven't come to a solution. We haven't shared what we think solutions might be, but kicking it around is extremely useful to hear these different perspectives. So I just thank you to every single one of you, and Paul, obviously, for organizing, Joey, obviously, for Discord, starting that. That's really impressive. And Cassidy and Catherine, you guys are incredibly good conversation partners. I'm fascinated. We could keep going. I was like, oh, it's 6:30. Oh man, we gotta shut this down.
And so on Bridges of Meaning Discord server, Friday, the 26th at 10 a.m. California time, we are going to have a special question and answer period where we are going to talk about this. So anybody that wants to get in on there, we got to find your way onto the Discord, which is a little bit trickier now. And we are going to do that on the Discord server. So thank you, James. Joey, Cassidy, anything you guys want to throw in?
I just want to say I do appreciate Joey's perspective, especially coming from a non-religious place where it's like there's a want for men in their 30s who are serious about marriage and want a more traditional view of that. And I think sometimes as a woman in church and outside of it, you don't get that narrative. And I can tend towards cynicism. So I think sometimes you get downtrodden, but to realize there is people who want those things. I think that's a good thing for women to understand. And there are people seeing it not just in this transactional way, but looking to build something bigger than themselves. And so that's a beautiful thing for sure.
And on the Discord server, we have our first engagement. People who met on the Discord server. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about that. So, and they are going to, after that couple is going to come on the channel sometime. And I'm going to have a conversation with both of them because, Bridges of Meaning Discord server where you can find your meaningful spouse, who knows? But I think it is the church, an element of the church has to serve a lot of different things, but an element of church is to be a community that leans into life in the age to come. And that gets complex with this in some ways, but you're right, Joey. In some ways,
come for the memes, not for the marriages. It's very much better chance you're going to find some good memes than you are a marriage.
There are good memes.
Still happy to see the marriage.
Yeah, but now you can start advertising to a female crowd and saying, "Look, we're promoting marriages. Come on in. There's plenty of good guys here."
There are good guys there. Joey's still on the market. How about it, ladies? So thank you all for doing this. Stay on the line. I'm just going to stop the recording, but I appreciate the time that each of you has given, and I hope we can do this again soon. And we might, based on some of these questions, and now that we y'all know each other a little bit and where you're coming from, we could probably have a little bit more targeted conversation next time. So thank you all.